Welcome to World Review, our weekly look at the news from around the world. I'm Carla Robbins, a recovering journalist now at the Council on Foreign Relations and Brewer College, sitting in for the redoubtable Ivo Dalder this week. Today we're going to be looking at President Biden's decision to visit Saudi Arabia next month, a country he described not so long ago as a pariah state. The White House is trying to lower expectations, saying the visit is unlikely to have any effect on gas prices. But if it's not about oil, and I'm frankly skeptical, then what's going on? We'll also look at the war of words between the US and China at the Shangri-La Security Dialogue. Is it all performance art, or are we moving towards something a lot more dangerous? And we'll talk once again about Ukraine. Is the war in the East shifting irretrievably in Russia's favor? And will the EU's expected offer of candidacy status and President Biden's promise of another $1 billion of military aid make a difference? Here with us to discuss the issues are my colleagues from Beirut, Kim Ghattas of the Carnegie Endowment in the Atlantic and formerly of the BBC. Lovely to see you virtually again. And the warning, Kim, of course, has limited electricity, but we're hoping that she'll be able to tough it out with us. Welcome, Kim. And from Washington, D.C., Nirmal Ghosh, who is recovering from COVID, but is going to tough it out as well. We're so glad to have you. He's U.S. Bureau Chief of the Straits Times. Nirmal, great to see you again.
Good to see you.
And from Munich, Stefan Kornelius, the political editor of Süddeutsche Zeitung. Stefan, great to have you. And do you guys still have electricity with the Gazprom squeeze?
We're running good, and it's pretty hot, so we don't need that much gas these days.
Okay, good. So Kim, let's start with you. So it's extraordinary that it's taken this long that Biden is finally scheduled to even take a trip to the Middle East. And the White House has finally confirmed what we've all known for quite a while, that after visiting Israel and the West Bank, he's going to travel to Jeddah to meet with MBS, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the man U.S. intelligence and pretty much all of us know ordered the murder and dismemberment of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. This is quite about pace for Biden. Why do you think he's going, and why is he going to go for that handshake?
Well, first, I think if you'll notice that the White House did not say that he's going to Saudi Arabia to shake MBS's hand. They were very careful how they framed the trip. They said he was going to Saudi Arabia, to Jeddah, which is currently chairing the GCC. So that's kind of the excuse of why he has to go to Saudi Arabia, because he's looking for this regional cooperation with Saudi Arabia and other partners from the GCC, but also Egypt and Jordan will be there. And he'll meet the King of Saudi Arabia, King Salman, and there might be a handshake with Mohammed bin Salman, is how this was put forward. Now, of course, he will most likely see Mohammed bin Salman. But the White House is very careful about how it's framing this, and it's making sure that it's framing this as something that is much more than just about oil. Why does he have to come to the Middle East? Why did it take so long? Why is he coming at all? This administration has been trying to not disengage from the region. I think it's more trying to right-size the amount of energy that this region takes from national security officials and from White House officials in general. And they try to hold out as long as possible. But I think there are two sentences that apply to this region. One is a play on a sentence that everybody knows. You may not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in you. There's just no getting away from it. You think you can do without Saudi Arabia, and then, Putin invades Ukraine, and then suddenly you need oil, you need gas, you need Qatar, and you need this regional cooperation because you're not at a stage yet where you have enough output in the US to cover for the shortfall. The issue with renewables, it's not set up yet. So suddenly you have to come back. You have to come back and talk to the Middle East, and it's not only about regional cooperation. And then the second sentence that I applied to this region, that actually applies to Las Vegas initially, is what stays in the Middle East, or what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. The repercussions of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, the repercussions even of the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, the Palestinian journalist, the repercussions of this still being the region that produces oil for China, for worldwide supply chains, etc. There's just, you cannot cauterize the wound and you cannot wall off this region. So I think it was inevitable. And I think how he handles his presence in the region and how they played out and what is going to be on the agenda is really going to set the tone for how it plays out.
So he's going to go to the West Bank, and he has not reversed, the U.S. embassy is still going to stay in Jerusalem, but he has restored the aid to the PA, to the Palestinian Authority. And so he's going to recommit the U.S. to a two-state solution. Do you expect Biden to re-engage seriously in the peacemaking process itself?
I don't think anyone has bandwidth for full-on peace talks between the Palestinians and the Israelis, but the reality on the ground is that the situation is untenable for Palestinians and therefore for Israelis as well in the long term and perhaps even in the short, medium term. The Abraham Accords were seen by Israel as a way to divert attention from the issue of occupation of Palestinian territories and start opening up to the Arab world. But that has limitations because there's only so far you can go. The Saudis are not going to sign up until there is progress on the Palestinian front. And it could all, go downhill if things really blow up in the Palestinian territories. And the tension is really building. It's a festering wound. It doesn't, make many international headlines, but the daily violence and humiliation of life under occupation is really not something that the world can or should turn away from. So there has to be something there. It has to be addressed. Now, again, the way the White House put it is that they will reiterate the support for a two-state solution. So they're not saying they're going to start full-on peace talks. But this phrase that they've been using since last year, with equal measures of security, freedom, and opportunity for the Palestinian people as for the Israeli people, is an interesting entry point into a broader conversation about how you can diffuse the tension and begin to have progress on these measures of easing the daily life of Palestinians. And the White House is hoping that they can bring the Saudis into this conversation in the short term, medium term, and long term. At different stages, they can contribute something different.
So, Nirmal, thank you for that. Nirmal, I want to bring you in here. What's been the reaction in Washington to this announcement? I saw two very reliable White House supporters, Dick Durbin and Tim Kaine, were out there complaining with pretty tough language that, Biden, even though, as Kim said, they were downplaying it, in the White House, that Biden was going to meet MBS. Durbin said the Saudis' record on human rights was, quote, an outrage. And Tim Kaine told CNN the trip was a really bad idea, that MBS's bloodstain has not been cleansed. Is this sort of about face by Biden going to alienate any constituencies, or does the president just get credit for trying pretty much anything to bring down oil prices? And for Democrats, any sort of photo op with an Israeli leader is a good photo op.
Yeah, I think all of the above, really. I think President Biden has to show some domestic dividend. And as Kim said, we have all these essentially paradoxical issues. Right now, you have the paradox of the values-based foreign policy and all that, and the Jamal Khashoggi murder and all the rest of it. But so this is a thin line he has to walk, even thinner than I would say in Asia, because he's actually going to Saudi. And he will have to show some domestic dividend, as you said. He has to show that, bring down prices somehow, so he's under tremendous pressure to do that. Now, all this criticism on human rights, yes, of course, but it will probably pass. There will be quite a storm, but this is a return. This is real politics, right? So he has to do this. And that storm will pass, but it's important, very crucial, that he shows some demonstrable dividend domestically. Otherwise, his critics will say, what was it all about?
So yeah, I mean, you remember that Putin high five with MBS. I'm sure that that Putin's going to be watching from whether or not I don't think Biden's going to high five with MBS, but people are going to be watching pretty closely. So Stefan, the Saudi leg of Biden's trip has gotten all the attention so far. What else should we be looking for? Is how much of this has to do with Iran?
Sure. This is exactly the issue which we should watch. And if you listen to the White House briefings and everyone who tries to spin this story, they all put a lot of emphasis on the fact that this is not about energy. This is a broader issue. This can only be Iran. Iran is breaking out of the nuclear deal. The deal is further away from completion than any time before. The Americans seem to have lost control over the process. On the regional level, we had President Erdogan from Turkey going to Saudi Arabia. I mean, this is the arch enemy per se. So him high-fiving with MBS is the big story, or was the big story 2 weeks ago. We would have seen this week the German Foreign Minister Baerbock from the Greens, who's a very moral-driven person, traveling to Saudi Arabia if she wouldn't have caught COVID. So she had to cancel the trip, but it was planned. It was a realist test on human rights issues, to put it that way. So you see a kind of alignment, a kind of getting along on all fronts, and it all has one reason. It's called Iran. And whether this prevents Iran from breaking out, but it basically ups the ante on both sides. The stakes are getting higher and higher. Israel is reaching out to the Gulf regions as well. So if you leave a vacuum, someone will fill it. And this is what we see right now, and this is why the president has to travel. So
the Iran deal, and we probably could do an entire 45 minutes on the Iran deal, but it's falling apart. The Iranians are saying they're not coming back unless they get off the terrorist list. There's reporting that the Israelis came out and said that the Iranians are building something else underground. Is Biden going in part to get Israel to not go more ballistic on this, or is that another space to watch further down the road?
That's probably better for Kim to answer.
Yeah. Do you think? Do you think we're at a crisis point on the Iran deal, or do you think that we can revisit that a few more weeks from now here?
I think that the building consensus is that it's going to be no deal, no war. No one's going to announce the death of the deal, and they're going to try not to go to war. And to do that, you need a really strong regional front, and you need Israel part of that. Officially, unofficially, in the background, the Saudis and the Israelis are talking to each other all the time, just not in public. And so Stefan's absolutely right that there's only so much you can get done on oil. I mean, even if you start pumping now, price at the gas pump isn't going to go down that much that quickly. So again, going back to the idea that, the Middle East, you may not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in you. I mean, the Iran deal is something that everybody has a stake in. And if it's not going to be, if it's not going to come to a conclusion, then you need to build the safeguards and the guardrails around it. And that involves more regional cooperation. What I found very interesting also is the inclusion of Iraq in the meetings in Jeddah. They're not part of the GCC, so they're on the fringe of that. And hopefully, President Biden can also show something tangible or promising in terms of an improvement of how the US deals with the threat of Iran. It's not just about nuclear stuff. It's also about countering the vision that Iran presents to the rest of the region and to the rest of the world, which is frankly something that my friend at Carnegie Endowment, Karim Sajjadpour, has termed very aptly as the axis of misery. You look at the situation in Iraq, you look at the situation in Syria, you look at the situation in Yemen, you look at the situation in my own country, Lebanon. This is not a vision for the future. And it's not a vision for the future for the people of Iran either. Now, again, I don't want to be misunderstood, and that's not what the Biden administration is calling for either. This is not about changing the regime of Iran, but about offering for the rest of the region something a little bit more positive. And if Iraq can get away from Iran to some extent by plugging it back into literally and figuratively, the Arab world to provide power, electricity for the people of Iraq who have the same power issues we have in Lebanon. That would be a real positive. But I want to say something about this issue of a foreign policy built on human rights that Nirmal was referring to. I think that for Biden to be able to sell his handshake with MBS, and sell is maybe not the best use of word, but to present what he's having to do to progressives, to defenders of human rights, to journalists and activists around this region who were really rattled and scared by Jamal Khashoggi's killing. The way to make sure that the message people take away from this visit is not, oh, America's allies can get away with murder, is to make sure that Jamal Khashoggi is mentioned. And when Mohammed bin Salman says, well, I wasn't responsible, but also you have other friends in the region, including Israel, who stand accused of killing journalists. Shireen Abu Akleh being one of them. And so far, although there was no outside independent investigation, all evidence points to the fact that she was killed by a bullet from an Israeli soldier. And so to advance the cause of accountability is much more interesting and important for this region and for America, which touts the idea of a rules-based international order, to advance a conversation, a real conversation about accountability for everyone. So instead of papering over the death of Shireen Abu Akleh and the death of Jamal Khashoggi, those two names should be front, right, and center during this visit.
Well, we'll see. I would suspect they're probably not going to do that while they're in Jeddah. The White House will point again and again to the fact that Biden is the one who ordered the release of the intelligence report on the murder, and they'll have to have the challenge of how to balance these things. Let's hope they do it.
Yeah, if I may just add one more thing. I think I grew up in Lebanon in a civil war. I had to deal with Syrian invasion, which crushed our vision for a free Lebanon. And then we lived under Syrian occupation for many years. So I understand the sort of the anger at quid pro quos, but this is the world we live in, unfortunately. Jamal was a friend. Shireen is somebody I admired for so long. So I'm trying not to be cynical, but to be realistic. And I think that balancing this requires also an understanding of the region that we're operating in. And the idea that the US can turn Saudi Arabia into a pariah and maybe sanction Mohammed bin Salman himself completely ignores the Iran part of this equation. And can you imagine the happy dance by the supreme leader of Iran himself if Mohammed bin Salman, his nemesis, was put on the sanctions? That was just never going to happen. It's just how it is, unfortunately.
We will have next week to review this as well, but thank you all for that. I know more now for what to look for. So shifting even further eastward, Nirmal, let's talk about the thriller in Shangri-La, the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. In Friday of last week, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin met China's Defense Minister, General Wei Fenghe, in one-on-one talks. We can't really call Wei his counterpart, since despite his title, he's a comparatively junior general. But that's really the only meeting the Chinese have been willing to agree to, and there had been hopes that even that was going to lower tensions. But, the readouts from both sides were anything but calming. And then over the weekend, both men gave speeches at this, National Security Forum. Well, okay, Nirmal, I'm going to turn it over to you there to describe what happened and tell us how seriously we should take all of this.
Right. So at that meeting and in Singapore, the two sparred over Taiwan, but they did meet for an hour, which was double the allocated time, which is interesting. So Austin apparently reiterated Washington's position on Taiwan is unchanged, one China and so forth. But he said, and this is according to an official, that the US has major concerns about increasing unsafe, aggressive, unprofessional PLA behavior and so forth. And later, Senior Colonel Wu Qian, who is a spokesman for China's Ministry of National Defense, said it was the usual things. It is not the mainland changing the status quo. It is Taiwan independence, secessionists, and outside forces, and so forth. Criticized U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. And according to him, General Wei told Austin, if anyone dares to split Taiwan from China, the Chinese army will not hesitate to fight at any cost. Now, there were some breathless headlines about this, but really when Taiwan comes up, you can't expect much else. These are things China has been saying for years. Provocative behavior is also not terribly new. So all this is par for the course when Taiwan comes up. So essentially, both US and China stated their positions and nothing really changes. Unfortunately, yes, they are completely different narratives and the gap is wide. But I think on balance, it was a positive that they actually met and talked. It was their first meeting, by the way, which is, of course, the purpose of the dialogue. And they said they want to keep talking. And that is also encouraging. Yesterday, US Ambassador to China, Nick Burns, mentioned how diplomacy and communication are really important to avoid accidents and misunderstandings. And I think both sides are cognizant of that. Separately, on June 13, Jake Sullivan, NSA Jake Sullivan, met with Yang Jiechi in Luxembourg. Both sides also acknowledged importance of open lines of communication. So all this is hopeful in terms of managing the competition. Now, just as a quick aside, Asian countries brought perspectives to the table, and one very good point was made by Singapore's Defense Minister, Ng Eng Hen, and that was that Asia does not see Ukraine, US-China competition and all that as an ideological struggle between autocracies and democracies. Asian countries, he said, and he wrote, are too diverse and pluralistic, and there would be, quote, few takers for a battle royale on that basis. So in short, Asian countries by and large don't buy into that framing, and they don't want to buy into it. That's one point. But he also said he appreciated not being forced to take sides. That's a continuing refrain. But a second issue has also arisen since then. It's separate but related, and that's the issue of China claiming that the Taiwan Strait is not international waters. In other words, that is China's internal waters. Now, one presumes the US will ignore that and continue to sail warships through it. And this does not per se lock China yet into taking more aggressive action. I mean, they did not start shooting down airliners after declaring the ADIZ over the East China Sea back in 2013. However, if this turns out to be a prelude to attempts to close the strait, including to US military ships, we may see more so-called gray zone harassment, tactics for which China has already been cited as infamous for, shining lasers, unsafe and unprofessional maneuvering, so forth. Remember, and again, this has a history. Back in 2013, a Chinese warship almost collided with the American missile cruiser Cowpens. So that is an area of some concern, and we're going to hear a lot more about that going forward, I think. So I think I'll stop there for now.
So are you saying that God forbid we journalists hyped the response to the language at the Shangri-La Dialogue? Because the people I talk to at the Pentagon think that the Chinese have qualitatively been far more assertive in the region, and I certainly read Austin's speech, and it seemed pretty in your face. So maybe the language is sort of normal language, but qualitatively, the Pentagon certainly thinks the Chinese are certainly being a hell of a lot more dangerous.
Well, I think the Pentagon is right in that sense. Qualitatively, China has become much more aggressive and much more assertive. But I think in terms of language, we've had this kind of language before. It's like when Kim Jong-un says something today. I mean, he said the same thing 10 years ago. That kind of thing. So I don't think journalists.
Are you saying that Lloyd Austin is like Kim Jong-un?
No. Of course not.
Just kidding.
Of course not. I'm just saying that the interpretation of language. I think in some respects there were some scary headlines, but I mean, the Post, for example, just reported the meeting, which I think, it sort of took in the perspective that this is the language they use. You use the term somewhat performative right at the top. And so, yes, this is the performative part, right? So I think, as I said, there is a huge gap in perception, and that is not narrowing. I mean, it is not a good outcome. The only sort of sliver of a silver lining is the fact that they have met and diplomatic meetings continue. But it is a very thin silver lining. I'll grant you that. It's not a great outcome, and there is no sign of these two completely different narratives, completely different perspectives, seeing things from the other side of the lens. There's no sign of that, and that's a worry for sure.
So you were saying about the and Stefan, I want to turn to you, but you, Nirmal was saying about the comment from Singapore that the people in the region don't want to see this as competition between autocracies and democracies. They basically don't want to see divisions. So the Trump administration took a very with us or against us approach to Europe on China, especially when it came to Huawei and 5G. The Biden administration seems to be just as hardline when it talks about China as the Trump administration did. But is it making similar demands of its allies when it comes to China, or is this Ukraine solidarity let Europe off the hook about making decisions about China these days?
Well, you don't see that much demand on China these days, and just look at the run-up of European representatives in Shangri-La. It was pretty dismissal. I mean, I think the French defense minister was there, and I'm not even sure about the British one, but that was it. German presence was almost not visible. It's a shame. Germany or Europe seems to shy away from the Pacific problems. The Taiwan Strait issue is an issue which just a couple of months ago was taken on by a couple of European countries sailing their ships through that as well. I know that there's debate now in Germany whether that should be repeated, but given the shyness last time, I don't have that much hope. There's one aspect, however, which we should watch. The self-isolation of China via the Ukrainian issue is growing. We saw a phone conversation between Xi and Putin just yesterday or 2 days ago, where they both reiterated that this has to deepen their relationship, that economic relationships have to grow despite outside pressure. And as we speak here now, we do see Xi having an appearance at the Petersburg Economic Forum right now in Russia. So this is a clear signal to the outside world. This is us against them. And so the rest of the Pacific world has a choice now. The funny part is, or actually the striking part, it's not funny, the striking part is that in a week's time, we'll see the G7 meeting here in Bavaria in Elmau, where it took place 2015 already, is convening again. And the overreaching theme of that G7 meeting is how to get the BRICS countries, how to get those sitting on the fence over to the democratic side. And the key exponent of the Asian Rim will be Indonesia. It'll be the Indonesian Prime Minister who's invited and who will appear, and where the G7 leaders do expect a clear commitment towards Western values, or at least sort of the democratic side. They're with us, not with them. So this process is taking place. It's continuing. It's more of a show process. In the end, it'll sort out much more differentiated, much more nuanced. But Shangri-La, seen from Europe, was like a nutshell of how it should not develop, being shrunken to a purely trans-Pacific issue and almost purely military issue. I didn't follow it that closely, but the things I saw were purely military issue. And you do lack the dialogue between sort of all the other levels which could engage in talk.
And of course, there's going to be a NATO summit as well, and they're going to be talking strategic concept. And I mean, is China going to be a focus of that as well, or is it all Russia all the time again?
It's not really decided. That there's a work on that strategic concept, and China will be part of it, and definitely they will map out the big challenge of the democratic world, or sort of the open societies versus autocratic societies. I think the Ukraine war is serving as a staunch reminder for all of us that there is a choice to be made. And I wasn't surprised. I was surprised that Shangri-La didn't cash in more on that angle. And it still shows how fragmentized our world works and how little the interconnections are seen.
I'll jump in just for a second. I think one of the views in Asia is that the Ukraine war is a European problem, and the rest of the world is being dragged down, and the Western alliance certainly bleeding Vladimir Putin. But I would argue, and some people have argued, that both sides underestimated each other. Russia is quite capable of carrying on for a very long time. and this sort of triumphalist, or Russia failed in the beginning. There is no sign. There's no discernible sign of peace talks. At some point, this war has to come to a negotiated solution, but there doesn't seem to be any.
I'm curious. Can I ask you one thing? I mean, you watch the scene much closer than I do. Isn't India taking sort of a new look at all of this? So the latest utterings you hear from Delhi are, well, our times with Russia are now different. This is a strategic challenge to the Indian interests. How did that play out in Shangri-La, or is it something which is more hotly debated?
No, it didn't play out so much in Shangri-La, but subsequently, America, the Washington has said that they want to. It's a tacit acknowledgement that American equipment is very expensive. They haven't, been giving India the most attractive terms, and so India has this massive dependency on Russian weaponry. But DC is recognizing that, and now they made noises. I think it was just yesterday or day before. I forget who it was, who said we have to offer India better terms, and India is the long-term strategic partner. It was called Campbell, the long-term strategic relationship of choice for the US. So it's a sort of touchy relationship, and India, I think, would like to reduce its dependency on Russia. It was placed in an awkward position. And very few of these countries actually, it would be an exaggeration to say they took Russia's side. They all condemned the invasion. Almost everybody, I think, in Asia condemned the invasion. But India is absolutely cognizant of this, and what you say is right. I mean, they would like to review the dependence on Russia, but there's a lot of historical baggage to get over, and they need to build a better tactical and strategic relationship with the US, and that's going to be a challenge for both sides again, because of the some of the contradictions inherent in dealing with a large country like India.
So we're in Ukraine. We might as well continue with Ukraine. So once again, we're going to turn to the war in Ukraine, and it's been a very difficult week there, especially on the Eastern Front, with Russia taking more territory, and the Ukrainians warning that Russians could take a lot more unless they are urgently supplied with everything from sophisticated artillery to basic ammunition for Soviet-era, rifles. At the same time, Zelensky got a visit from Germany's Olaf Scholz, from Italy's Mario Draghi, from France's "Can't we all just get along?" Emmanuel Macron, and today from Boris Johnson. A pledge of more arms from NATO, and a reminder from Moscow of its power with the cutoff of gas to the leaders who dared to show up. EU's getting ready to offer Ukraine candidate status, I believe. So, Stefan, can you bring us up to date? And Kim, I'm going to ask you a question right after that on the Ukraine conflict and Zelensky and the allies.
Well, you pretty much summed it up already. These were the big steps this week. Actually, a quite packed week on Ukraine again. Probably the highlight was that visit by 4 heavyweights from the EU in Kiev. Both Macron and Scholz overcoming their deep anxiety to get closer and get sort of the feeling of that conflict, aligning with Zelensky, trying to finally brush away all these irritations which have built up over the past weeks, especially on weapons delivery and so on. And if we dig into the details there, we'll find out that things are far more nuanced and complex than they look at the first hand. The Ukrainians are extremely well in putting pressure on the EU, drawing the EU closer and NATO closer to the conflict, which is in their interest, and fully understandably, they want to actually get them in because that saves their back. Macron was in the probably most awkward position of all of them, because he has this signaling going on to Putin all the time that, yes, as you say, well, can't we all friends, and can we talk? Whereas let's say, Baltic countries, for example, say it doesn't make sense to pick up the phone at all. If he wants to talk, he knows how to reach us. Putin retaliated immediately the moment they went on that trip, the moment they went on the train on the right to Kiev. He cut down gas supplies to the west. Germany now 40% down by Nord Stream 1. France totally cut off. Italy 40% down. the Czech Republic being down dramatically. So this is really hurting now. Right now it's warm in Europe, so the gas supplies can be upheld and industry can still use what they need. But we're talking of stocking up the gas supplies. We're talking about filling their storages. They're now at an average of 50% fillage, which isn't enough to get over the winter. So this is coming as a huge hit. Putin, now speaking at this earlier mentioned conference at Petersburg just a couple of minutes ago, was actually hitting out extremely hard against the US as being sort of the colonial power of Europe and the world, of Europe needing to stand up against this. So the broad scheme of this war, the broad idea of this being sort of one of these eternal conflicts between self-determined sovereign countries and colonialized democratic slaves, which are lost in a system which is dysfunctional, is still up and alive. It's not about the eastern part of Ukraine. It's not about Donbass or Donetsk and Luhansk. It's about a broader issue. And we saw Putin a week ago when he talked or compared himself to Peter the Great, where we all realized, well, this man is so full of his grievances, of his hate, of his worldview, which he wants to pose on us, that the challenge we do see now is broader than just territorial. And this is why the EU's reaction to all of this today, by supporting the idea of candidate status for Ukraine, is yes, a rather symbolic one, but then also an immediate political one. The Commission has no final say in this. The EU Council meeting next week, the summit, will vote on it, and there is actually a pretty stark opposition to that idea, mostly from Spain, from Portugal, from the Dutch, and from the Austrians, and it has to be a unanimous vote. But nevertheless, the political pressure to do something, to even to be symbolic and be behind Ukraine, is huge. So I do expect this to happen with some caveats attached to it, and it'll take years and years, but that doesn't matter. The big issue is Ukraine is part of the Western world. Just forget about it being a buffer state. Forget about it being neutral. Forget about it to be sort of your punching ball. It's part of our world. So even if you take slices away of it, Ukraine will find its holes in the West. So I'll leave it here. Story will continue. Just for probably a brief outlook on what sort of the military say now and how this drags out over the next weeks. There are two scenarios. One is the surprise breakdown of either side. And we saw also flinches of that this week, where we thought, well, the Ukrainians are not that much longer able to hold the front. The other scenario is the dragging out scenario. 2 more months of supplies, of weaponry, of actually manpower to fight that war. And then it will grind to a halt. Probably Russia holding all of Donetsk by that time. And then we will see some regrouping and some probably negotiating to start. But these are the two big things to watch. So my guess is by the end of summer, we'll know at least which broad direction this will take.
So Stefan was talking about the revealing of the grievance-filled Putin, as well as the delusional Putin of the Peter the Great. Kim, these are the big unknown is, what will Putin settle for? Are there any limits to his brutality, I suppose? You've watched Russian behavior in Syria for a long time. You spent some time writing about inside Putin's head. Are there any lessons there to be drawn that we can look at right now in Ukraine?
I think that there is no limit to the brutality, unfortunately. That's something that I've learned as well, looking at the unfolding conflict in Syria, which started out as a peaceful uprising and turned into a civil war, and then with the intervention of Russia in 2015 degenerated into something also even more horrific. And as Nirmal pointed out, the West, I think, often underestimate or doesn't analyze this properly when it's dealing with people like Putin or like Bashar al-Assad. They only need to hold on to power. That's victory already, whether it's Putin or Bashar al-Assad. The West, the approach of countries like the US or Europe, they're into showing what the victory looks like, and it has to be constructive and positive. So to think that Putin is just going to roll over and say, okay, you know, I lost because he hasn't achieved his goal. He doesn't care if Ukraine is a wasteland. It suits him fine. It means that there's no democratic country on his border. And who's going to hold him accountable? Again, you know, I'm a bit obsessed with the concept of accountability because I see how it is corrosive and how it erodes stability. And not just in non-Western parts of the world, but also even in the US. I mean, that's why we're having the hearings on about January 6th, because you need accountability. Otherwise, it's the law of the jungle and there are no rules anymore for anyone. You know, what's interesting in the Middle East is, unlike what Nirmal was saying, this is not seen as just, you know, Europe's war and, you know, Europe's problem, because the impact is felt directly in many, many ways. Because of the proximity of Syria and Russian troops in Syria, everybody's jockeying for power now. Is Russia going to have to pull out? Is it going to no longer be able to support Iran in its positioning? Where does that leave Israel? If Russia can't protect Assad anymore, what does that mean for the Iranians? Is this an opportunity for the US to come back in? So everybody's kind of jockeying for power there. And of course, also the impact on the Middle East, but also the rest of the world. So yes, everybody is being dragged in. Is going to be the impact on food security, and you know, what is the fall going to look like when it comes to access to wheat and cooking oil, etc. Those things are being felt very, very acutely here.
So Kim raised my favorite topic for this week, and many other topics which we should definitely be dealing with and will, which is the January 6th hearing and this question of accountability. Nirmal, you know, limited amount of time, your reaction to it. You're in DC, are you watching it as obsessively as I am? And do people back home where you write, do they care? And does it have any impact on how they look at the United States?
Yeah, I'm watching it, and I've been writing on it as well, and people do care. People are very interested in it. Of course, a lot of it's performative, right? The first thing was prime time and all that, so we couldn't get away from it. I think there's a lot of consternation at a deterioration of the political environment in the US. I think there are several vectors which indicate that things might get literally violent leading up to 2024. I mean, the polarization is so great. In terms of, so there have been 3 hearings, and we do not know whether they have shifted public perception. But right at the beginning, it was safe to say that those people who believed that Donald Trump was behind it and planned it, with that belief cemented, and those who believe that it was a righteous uprising, like Donald Trump said, and all that, and you know, it is just, you know, trying to save in their own narrative that they were trying to save the country, they will believe it regardless. So it's people in the middle whom we have to figure out whether this has shifted public opinion. But I think there's a lot of discussion now about whether they are laying the ground for laying actual charges against Donald Trump. And a lot of concern, I have a lot of concern given Donald Trump's reaction. He released that 12-page thing in which he called it a treasonous committee. This is sort of talking right to that hardcore base of his. And if they lay charges against him, if they even arrest him or something, I think we are looking at a very, very potentially violent and election season ahead. Starting with the midterms and then building up to 2024, it's going to be a little worrisome. And if the US does implode, I mean, implode is a big term, and maybe I'm exaggerating a bit, but if it implodes in that kind of manner, then what kind of America will emerge from it is the question. Who is going to win in this huge internal fight? So yeah, there's a lot of concern and attention being paid to this.
So Stefan, in the minute we have left, how's it playing in Germany?
Well, I'd give you a totally different take in 2 sentences. And I mean, I totally subscribe to what Nirmal said, because I'm a junkie on this as well. But honestly, it feels so backward. It feels so looking back and so retrospective that I can hardly imagine that the American voters want to deal once again with that mess. in an election. It would be so un-American to go back and relive the whole thing rather than jump to something new. So that's my hope, beyond all the mess we do see. And I agree with all what Nirmal says. It's a nightmare, but who wants to have it back?
And Kim, the last 20 seconds, Lebanon certainly knows polarization. How's it playing there?
I don't think that people here have time to think very much about America's politics. They look with concern because they always worry, well, what might this mean for Lebanon? I had a piece in The Atlantic last year before the presidential election, which they, interestingly enough, titled America's Future Might Be Lebanon. But we're trying to get out of polarization, so I hope we can then lead the way for the rest of the world how to figure out a way outside of polarization.
Inshallah. So that's it for this week. I want to thank Stefan Kornelius, Nirmal Ghosh, and Kim Ghattas for a great conversation and for being very tolerant with me on my first time out covering for Ivo Daalder. We'll be back next week for another edition of World Review. And for everyone watching, please continue to do so and have a great weekend. See you all soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us, Carla.
Thanks for having me. All the best.